Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
Hello again, dear friends. Thank you for joining us on another exciting adventure into future possibilities. This is Mission Evolution, where we share innovative thoughts and information with today's leading experts, bringing evolutionary solutions to our current challenges. You, my treasured audience, are a very important part of this discussion. Email info@missionevolution.org with any comments or questions. We'll address them on the very next show. So please, jot down your thoughts and share. This hour, we'll be exploring climate crisis, manifestation of the human shadow. After the unprecedented upheaval of 2020, we focused Mission Evolution's guests and topics on creatively moving forward to manifest a better tomorrow. Many practices, both ancient and modern, teach that our outer world is merely a reflection of the inner one. This concept is found so many sources that it warrants a closer look. If indeed our inner landscape creates the outer one, we're in a world of hurt on both counts. Looking outwards, we see wars, rioting, civil unrest, anarchy, climate crisis, pandemic, and massive death of species. If this is a reflection of our inner workings, I'd have to say our inner worlds are one big hot mess. Historically, the tendency has been to attempt fixing things from the outside while denying any dysfunction on the inside. What would happen to the outer world if instead we turned within and addressed the imbalances that have been festering there for generations? With us this hour to explore that very thing is Jack Adam Weber. Jack is a licensed Chinese medicine clinician with over 20 years' experience. He's also a life coach, climate activist, organic farmer, artist, and celebrated poet. His most recent book is Climate Cure: Heal Yourself to Heal the Planet. Jack writes about holistic medicine, emotional depth work, mind-body integration, and climate crisis. He developed the Nourish Practice, a deeply restorative somatic meditation experience that doubles as an educational guide for healing through the wounds of our childhood. His website, jackadamweber.com. Jack, on behalf of our listeners and myself, thanks for joining us on Mission Evolution.
Thanks, Gwilda. Good to be here with you.
I'm so glad to have you. So you're a licensed Chinese medicine clinician. Where did you get your training?
I studied and trained at Yosan University, which was in Santa Monica. It's now moved to Culver City, but that's in the Los Angeles area, Southern California.
How long does it take to become a licensed Chinese medical clinician?
Too long.
I hear that.
The program itself was 4 years, year-round.
Goodness.
Yeah.
Goodness. Would you describe for our listeners exactly what is a Chinese medicine clinician? What all do you cover?
Chinese medicine primarily relies on 4 domains of treatment therapeutics. So one is acupuncture, the other's herbal medicine, the third is meditation, energy practices, and the fourth is diet and lifestyle.
What drew you to the field?
Oh boy, I'll give you the short answer. I was originally in college as a pre-med student. I wanted to become a Western medical trained surgeon, and I still think I would have been really good at that. But I took the acupuncture needle instead, and I disillusioned with Western medicine and that trajectory. So I took a lot of time off and got into Tai Chi and Qigong and meditation practice. And I originally wanted to study Ayurveda deeply, and I did for a time, but then it wasn't really recognized here in the United States as well as Chinese medicine. So I delved into Chinese medicine and found a wonderful home in it.
What does being a Chinese medical clinician have to do with the climate crisis?
Well, a lot. I would say that, there are lots of ways to answer that question. I'll just start by throwing out that yin yang and the five elements, which are the foundational metaphorical frameworks of Chinese medicine, are real life representations of our interface and interaction with the natural world. And the yin yang symbol and the five elements are overarchingly metaphors and systems of wholeness. So that kind of wholeness means that human beings have to live in accord with the natural world. And that means both regulating and integrating ourselves and outwardly treating the world kindly and respectfully, so that the world treats us well and we treat us well in a reciprocity. And then just the last little bit is that I became galvanized to the climate crisis because my practice is rooted in a reverence of nature and working with natural products. And when I realized that the planet itself and the natural world was in such dysfunction, the healer in me came out and said, the earth needs to be my patient, because if the earth isn't well, then how can we be well? So that's kind of how it grew for me. And my love of Chinese medicine is rooted in my love of the natural world.
I know that now I haven't studied much of Chinese medicine, but I have studied deeply in Native American medicine, and you're reflecting the same thing. They talk four elements:
Right.
water, air, earth, and fire. But it's my many of my teachers told me we cannot separate ourselves from what we do to the world.
Right.
And to the degree that we separate ourselves from the world, we separate ourselves from balance. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a good summary of it.
Yeah. Okay. In your latest book, you made a connection between personal healing and healing the planet. Could you explain to us how you got there?
Sure. So, before this interview, I really, and before each interview, I try to kind of dig down and feel what's most alive for me and what I most want to share. And so when I realized the climate crisis and I realized the extent and the severity of the climate crisis, I was alarmed. I was depressed. I was sad. I was really bent out of shape. And so I was bewildered at how we could have such a crisis happening and so few people engaged. And most of my friends and most of the public I interact with and most of the media, that people were just not aware of what was going on. And it was like, how can we have this horrible thing happening and so few people are engaged? So my meditation, my inquiry, I began an inquiry process. Why is that the case? Why are we in such denial, right? In short. And I began to formulate some hypotheses about that. I began to have conversations with people, with scientists, with educators, with psychologists, with colleagues in Chinese medicine. And because of my love of depth psychology and my sense that so much of what we do and don't do in the world has to do with our inner worlds, and especially how integrated we are emotionally and cognitively, this prevents us from really engaging with the world. And there are also so many stressors from outside: the dysfunctional system that we live in, capitalism, inequality, injustice. We've seen that especially under the governance of Trump and the GOP lately. But go ahead.
Uh-huh. I've got kind of, if I try to word this question properly, we're talking about climate crisis, and we'll continue to do so. But at the opening of the show, I listed all sorts of other things going on. But aren't they all the same thing? The climate being our Earth, but then, the pandemic, the anarchy, the social unrest, all of that stuff, isn't that absolutely related?
Yeah, I think that they're all crises, and they all demand of us a similar response. And that response, I think, originates from a similar place of integration or non-integration inside us, and also the system in which we're in. We have certain limits in which we can act and be effective in the world. So I think we need to change outwardly and inwardly in that sense.
So I guess my question was, does all the other crises that we're facing also come from within? Like we're talking about our disconnection from the planet and what we do to it. Is that also the source of the other problems we're looking at?
Yeah, my opinion is that it's a reciprocal dynamic. So yes, I think that we project and displace our own lack of integrity onto the world. And then the worse that world becomes, and the systems that we create kind of become their own problem, and then act back upon us, creating further distance and fractioning. So and that creates a vicious spiral downward. And what
Round and round we go. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and what I try to share in Climate Cure and my work generally is how to turn that spiral upward, right? So that we begin to create integration again.
That's absolutely what we're trying to focus on here. So I'm so glad to hear you say that. What do you see as the major crisis of our time? What do you see as the biggest problems here?
In terms of what, outwardly, inwardly?
Just in general, what do you think is the most impactful thing going on right now? Sans politics. Of course, we don't go there, but.
Okay. I mean, outwardly, we have the pandemic, and we have behind that the climate crisis, which is an ongoing crisis. I think we'll get through the pandemic, but the pandemic is also in unobvious ways linked to climate crisis and the degradation of the environment, and how we've impinged upon the natural world, and how viruses transmit more easily when we're in contact with the natural world in inappropriate ways, and as that natural world is stressed. And inwardly, I think the biggest crisis is emotionally, honestly. I think that we have to face our pain and deal with our pain and deal with our historical, collective, and personal traumas. And from there, we can have healing that we can move out into the world with.
Do you think it's in avoidance of that inward wounding that we have become so careless outwardly?
Yes.
In a simple word, right?
Yes.
So there's no doubt we've been in a world of upheaval. How does the resulting human fear and anxiety impact the environment and each other?
So you alternate between really easy questions and then really deep questions, and I have to pause to see how to answer it concisely yet thoroughly.
And we're about to come up on a break, so if we have to bridge the answer to the next segment, we can certainly do so.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really big topic you just brought up, and I'll just start with fear. I feel that fear is perhaps the cornerstone emotion inside us that causes us to retreat and sort of shy away from being engaged in the world, or not. And there's a dynamic that I described called that I coined called our fear mark. And the fear mark is like our threshold of fear beyond which we will not act and we will not pay attention and therefore go into denial because it's too scary to face the truth. So the more we can deal with difficulty, the more we can deal with scary truths and scary things, the more we can raise our fear mark and the more we can engage in the world because our threshold for fear and engaging with discomfort is higher.
Beautiful. Well, it's time for that promised break, and we will pick up on this on the other side because I think you're right. It's a very complicated and important question. So it is time for that commercial break. Jack and I will return shortly, so don't go away. You're listening to Mission Evolution, coming to you on the X Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net. Hello again. This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're dedicated to unification and evolution of consciousness. To all our faithful and thoughtful listeners, we really value your opinion. We'd love to hear from you. What do you think about the impact of human health on the natural world? This in from a member of our audience regarding the episode entitled Lockdown Stress, Eating and Addictions. JC shares, I had no idea how food impacts addictions. It's opened my eyes to many things I can do to help myself and my family. Thanks, JC. Joseph brings to light some key elements that can shift the way we approach addictions of all kinds. I'm glad to have been able to share him with you. Curious, dear audience? Visit our archives at missionevolution.org. Listen to the episode entitled Lockdown Stress, Eating and Addictions, and let us know what you think. Email me at info@missionevolution.org and give me your thoughts or questions so we can all share them on the next show. With us this hour, discussing how human health impacts climate change, is Jack Adam Weber. His website, jackadamweber.com. Jack, we were just getting into a fear mark and denial. And if there's one thing that we've certainly seen throughout the pandemic and on all the things that have been going on, is this polarization and denial. So people take opposite sides of the fence and then deny everything in between. And it seems like we've been ripped apart in the middle and there's no place to meet. Is this have part to do with the fear mark?
That's a good question. And, when fear is activated in us, it triggers our fight or flight response. So that fight or flight response, just look at it, fight or flight, right? That's a polarization in itself. So fear, when it comes up, if it goes unmitigated and unreckoned with, it causes a polarized response. And if we follow it, then we become polarized. So the important part of working with fear, in my estimation, is that when fear comes up, we have to look at it, we have to evaluate, we have to feel it, but also evaluate whether it's a realistic fear or an unrealistic fear. And I think that there are realistic fears and other ones that we need to challenge. So do we abide the fear or do we challenge the fear? And for example, abiding a fear is being afraid of the virus, right? Being afraid of coronavirus. That's a reasonable fear. But then that fear can grow unreasonably unless we keep it mitigated. So that's kind of the lack of nuance that happens in the social media realm, is that people look at fear just very superficially and in a polarized fashion instead of an integrated fashion. And a fear, for example, that we don't need to abide is, it is more in the anxiety realm sometimes, where there's something that scares us, but as we look at it, it's not a true fear that will actually hurt us, like asking someone out on a date or giving a public talk, right? Those things bring up tremendous fear, but are things we can move through and they're not really going to hurt us. So I think breaking down fear and really exercising emotional intelligence with how we do that is the cornerstone for not being victim to what FDR said of being afraid of fear itself. So a lot of people are just afraid of fear and denigrate fear. But no, fear has a very valuable, important purpose to save us and to direct us to right action.
There's something else that you brought up, and we'll talk more in depth at it a little later in the program. But it has to do with childhood damage and trauma. And I'd like to ask you, how much of our fear that we pick up or express in the present is actually not present at all, but simply triggered by present events, but it's actually fear from our past?
Yeah, I think a lot of that has happened. I think a lot of the hysteria that we're experiencing during the pandemic is a triggering of fear and past trauma, and that sense of insecurity and the sense of things breaking down. And, when we harbor wounds in our heart, our figurative heart, when we harbor wounds in our emotional body, it's unconscious. And things that bring the unconscious to the surface can bring about great chaos. And I think that that's a lot of what's happening. So I think that's an example of where it's reasonable to fear the virus, But then what about the hysteria? What about the panic, right? That turns into anxiety and chronic anxiety. And then there's veritable reasons for anxiety. But when these things get triggered, that requires that emotional intelligence. And for me, it requires also having the self-knowledge of what our triggers are and what our particular wounds are and what sets us off, so that when we are triggered from the outside, whether it's in a relationship or whether it's in a pandemic, that we can step back, we can pause, and we can see what's going on, so that we can create an integrated, wise response instead of just a panicked one.
Do you think that the pressure that we're under and all the stimulus, not so positive, the negative stimulus that we're experiencing, is actually giving us an opportunity to access and clear these hidden traumas that are in denial?
I appreciate your asking that. Absolutely. And so that's the perspective that I offer in the book. It's a cornerstone of climate cure, is to change our perspective from, oh, this is so scary, oh, this makes me feel terrible. That's why I mentioned earlier that we need to abide difficulty. And I think that that's really important, whether we're dealing with a pandemic or climate crisis, is to abide difficulty. So abide what feels not so comfortable and try to make friends with that space. Because if we don't, then we simply shy away and we become disconnected. And Gwilda, just remind me, what was your question once again? Because I went off and then I forgot it. I'll just try to
It's okay.
bring it
I
full
was
circle.
just asking. That's okay. I was asking if the trauma that we're experiencing can actually be transmuted
right.
to be used to heal within.
Right. Thank you. I get lost
Mm-hmm.
sometimes. So yes. Something I like to share is that our our inner lives and our inner wounds and the outer wounds and outer crisis intersect in our hearts. So that I mentioned earlier that as we're triggered from the outside and these sort of old wounds come up in a very amorphous, form, as just like raw emotion and reactivity, that we step back and we can actually view crisis in a spiraling upward way, that we get to have the opportunity to heal inwardly and heal outwardly, instead of just, oh, this makes me feel terrible, oh, that's awful, and we just shrink away, right? So the way to rise to the occasion is to see it as a healing crisis and opportunity.
I would ask you to, if you have some tools, because we all pop in and out of this stuff moment to moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can be clear and present, and something comes up, and pretty soon we're in our history and we're in the back brain in fight or flight rather than in the heart,
Mm-hmm.
where we can communicate.
Mm-hmm.
How can one start to catch themselves when they're about to take that downward spiral?
Mm-hmm.
And are there some techniques or some ways, A, you can tell you're going there, and B, you can short stop it?
That's a good question. So I think taking deep breaths is the first thing I would recommend. And even before deep breaths is to recognize when you're triggered. So if you're triggered and you're having a reaction, pause and begin to breathe. Don't engage, pause. And if it's with, a loved one, or if it's in response to somebody on a social media thread, pause and notice what's going on. And then the second tier would be, okay, what is going on? What's being triggered? What am I feeling? Am I feeling angry? Am I feeling afraid? Am I feeling sad? And to acknowledge that, and then from there, you can see if the present situation is meritorious of the reaction that you're having. Are you responding to the situation, or are you strongly reacting to the situation? And I think that when our reactions are out of proportion to the stimulus, to the issue at hand, then we have a chance to look at how we can interface and become better acquainted and friends with and work with the particular emotions that are coming up. And those are going to be different protocols and different ways of being with grief and with anger, with anxiety, with fear, with hopelessness, etc.
As we as individuals do that, how does that impact our environment? Because I've had people say, Gwilda, I can be off, totally off. And you just kind of hold this center. And of course, I work with this all the time, is what I have to do.
Hmm.
But it seems like there's almost like mojo that goes out into the room that other people respond to. Would you speak to that a little?
In terms of speak to holding one center or
The impact
regulation.
holding one's center can have on our environment.
Mm. Well, I think that there's a guy that did a really cool podcast I listened to a while ago, and one of my takeaways from that was he was talking about um, I was it apes or something, or gorillas, and there's the silverback, and the silverback was kind of the one like holding the space while all this squabbling was happening, and he said, be the silverback, and I really appreciated that, so I try to keep that little mantra in my head sometimes. Um, so to dive into your question more specifically, recent neuroscience shows us that a lot of our decisions and our beliefs are predicated upon emotion, so that we have emotion in the body before we make decisions. And our decisions are less cognitive, right? Less intellectual than we actually think they are. So the more that we can be in touch with our emotional body and what's unconscious in us, I think the better we can keep in check our decisions and not act on our unconscious and knee-jerk emotions. Does that speak to what you wanted to hear?
It does, to a certain extent, because these are big questions, I know. But
Yeah,
what
it's
what 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 you're saying is like know thyself is the key here, isn't it?
yeah, know thyself, and go back to your question before about how to regulate and how to present what you need to present in the world in the most helpful way possible. And sometimes that is paradoxical. Sometimes that's standing up with anger, and sometimes that's striking something down, and sometimes that's not looking very compassionate. But ultimately, if it's if it's embodied wisdom, then the goal is always, and the result will be to have a positive outcome. So, when we have to take strong action, act with tough love and and,
What
and
do you,
fierce compassion.
what do you mean by embodied wisdom?
In the sense that there's an integration between emotion and intellect. So there's a lot of wisdom out there in the world, and it's intellectual wisdom, but I think a lot of the wisdom that's out there, whether they're memes or sayings or quotes that we really like, there's a ton of experience behind that. And that experience often requires a certain amount of suffering and difficulty. And to reckon with and reconcile difficulty to 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 birth wisdom requires being in your body and working through difficulty both cognitively and emotionally.
So being embodied is a huge topic too, isn't it? Because it seems like
Yeah.
a lot of us are pretty disassociative at this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is the disassociation a result of denial? Like so much of our emotion is held in our body. Do we
Mhm.
disassociate to avoid it?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that pings back to what we were talking about before, about not dealing with our pain. So when we don't deal with our pain, we just we just don't engage.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, it's that magical moment for another commercial break. On the other side, we'll get deeper into suffering, pain, and how to transmute it into our gain. Jack and I will return to our discussion shortly. So you stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, and we're coming to you on the X Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net. Welcome back. This is Mission Evolution. Did you know our entire leading edge information packed past episode collection is available to listen or download with our compliments? Visit our archives at www.missionevolution.org for our ever growing selection of guests and topics. To find out more about me, Gwilda Wiyaka, my school, or the evolutionary tools we offer, visit www.findyourpathhome.com. Our guest this hour is Jack Adam Weber. We're speaking about the interconnectedness of human health and that of the planet. His website, jackadamweber.com. Jack, we were starting to get into suffering, pain, and the wisdom that can be gained from that, which puts us right back into, well, we've been seeing a lot of suffering and pain. How can we transmute that into wisdom?
So wisdom for me is something that's birthed from the darkness often. And I have to invoke Carl Jung here and the depth psychologists, that going into the pain body and going into the depths of our core wounds, whether those are from childhood or even from our adult lives, that when we don't face our pain, there's an expression, hurt people hurt others. And that's sort of the dynamic by which I see that we displace our own pain onto the world. And the cornerstone of dealing with this pain, in my experience, okay, there are lots of ways to deal with pain. There's mitigating pain. I do that, with acupuncture and Chinese medicine and diet, etc. But the deepest way that I have discovered to really address pain at its root is through grief work. And grief work is something I discuss extensively in Climate Cure. And grief is like the polisher of our souls. It's what helps dissolve pain inside of us, just the way soil bacteria break down what's no longer usable, right, to us and create nourishment, which perpetuates the fertility cycle, which is regeneration. So the way that we affect that regeneration inside of us is to engage what I call in a poem the soil's equivalent. And the soil's equivalent to that beneficial bacteria inside of us is grief and grief work. And by feeling our pain and by going into our past, ideally done with a psychotherapist or counselor or trauma expert, this way we cry out our pain, we emote our pain, and part of that is anger work, which is part of the larger body of grief work. So really going into grief work and polishing our soul, because in the way of releasing the pain that we've held inside, and that's a deep way to heal the core of ourselves, so that we can become more clear and give something beautiful and loving to the world. And that process of grief work itself, in my experience, really galvanizes and emboldens compassion and empathy inside of us.
As you're speaking, it comes to me, nature does this wonderful thing that, things bud in the spring, but they die in the fall and they go under the snow to be composted in the winter. And that's a form of letting go, letting things go back to their constituent parts. Mm-hmm. Isn't that what grief does for us? And why do we avoid it so?
Yes. You speak in my language, Gwilda, almost as if you've read my book twice. Yes. So when I mentioned earlier the yin-yang symbol and the cycle of the 5 elements, that's the seasons of life. So we go through the summer, the fruition of summer, into the decline of autumn, to the death of winter, to the rebirth of spring. That is the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. So that is what grief does for us. I call it dying to our pain. So, and that's the process I just described in grief work, so that we relive and we re-experience the pain inside of us that has been sheltered from us, and that has been stuffed down and repressed. And there's no shame in that. As kids, and some of us have had to go through horrific experiences in life, and we had to dissociate and we had to separate. So there's a very blessed and 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 um, and fortuitous uh, dynamic of dissociation. But as adults, I think that part of becoming an adult and the rite of passage into adulthood is to unearth these pains so that we can treat the world kindly and we can treat others kindly and not just displace our pain via hurt people, hurt others.
That so explains this damage and pain that's been passed down generation to generation. Is if the parents don't do the inner work, and it was never supported in times past. I mean, way times past certainly, but in our recent society, it hasn't been. Just pull up your bootstraps and get on with it.
Right.
So then we put it in denial when it lashes out of there and strikes at our children when they display the same things we've judged against in ourselves. How much of this generational damage do you think we're being confronted with at this point, rather than just our own?
I think that I think a lot of it, and we touched on that earlier. That's the generational pain that you're discussing, and it's the work of grief work. I mean, for me personally, there were times when I went through this work in my 20s, and there were times when I was deep in the work, and felt this. I felt these wounds just energetically going back generations. And then I saw the evidence of it, in my grandparents, in my great grandparents. But I felt like I was breaking a cycle that had lasted for so long. So unless we do that, we just keep creating more of the same crap, right? So it's like in an intimate relationship. If you don't wake up to how you're sabotaging or injuring or creating violence in the relationship, you're just going to keep creating it. So that's the inner work.
So I love that you said it this way, the recreate part, because if we don't process it out, we hold the same imprint and superimpose the events of the past on the present and make a rerun out of the future.
Yeah.
And you're saying it's the grief work that can start to break that up, even if it includes, or particularly if it includes anger work.
Yes. And for me, anger work is part of grief work because anger, in my experience in working with others, we're angry and we're pissed off that we've been treated this way and that we were violated or that we were abused or that we were neglected or, whatever it is. And, I also want to just point out that I think there's this idea or this myth that, if we do grief work, if we do inner work, then we're like perfect and healed and whatever. And it's like, no, that's not my experience. I used to think it was possible, and maybe it is for some, but I've done quite a lot of the work, and I find that, I still have my triggers, but I'm just so much more aware of those triggers, and there's a lot less fuel inside me that goes into acting out or reacting so that I can pause, and there's just a lot more integration, but the triggers are still there, and we become aware of them, so it's a constant practice and a constant refining and healing process with self and with others.
And again, it brings me back to all these crises we've been facing are the fuel to enter into that process, aren't they? They can be, should we choose.
I'm sorry, what was that? I think we broke up
I said,
just a little bit there.
It's okay. Going back to where we kind of started here, that the extreme crisis we find ourselves in right now can be the catalyst to be able to really engage in that work should you choose.
Right. And I think that's really promising. That's the sun on the horizon, and that's the morning sun right now, figuratively speaking, is that, that we are in crisis collectively, and instead of waking up each day and saying, oh, another shitty day, another horrible time in the pandemic and the climate crisis, whatever's going on, it's like, let me engage with this. Let me be proactive, and in being proactive and paying attention to what's difficult and to the problems in the world and becoming an activist, you get to be confronted with a lot of your pain. And I think that's a lot of why people don't do it, right? So the more we can deal with our pain and face the darkness, and be supported by the light at the same time, the better world we're going to be able to create for however long we or anything lasts.
I can't agree with you enough. So, where do addictions play into the current condition of our
Addiction?
environment? Addictions.
When you say that word in this context, one of my mentors comes up, Marion Woodman, was a Jungian psychologist, and she speaks brilliantly about addiction, and she talks about the climate crisis as well and the environmental crisis. They're a bit separate and they overlap, but she calls us just addicted animals, that we just keep pursuing addiction. And with the climate crisis, that looks like consumption, right? So the more we consume, the more we feed the needless capitalistic machine, the more fossil fuels we burn, the more we pollute the planet, etc. So there's an addiction in consumption and distraction. There's also addiction in all the ways that we try to entertain ourselves to deny facing reality and the problems that we have. And I think that addiction is very dangerous in that sense also. That's not to say that, again, nuanced, right? Not black or white thinking, but black and white thinking here is that, it's wonderful. We should all distract ourselves. We should all have fun, but to a limit. It's when our distractions and the degree to which we pursue the light and entertainment are used as a way to wholesale deny and to perpetuate what we don't want to see, which builds the shadow, which then comes back at us from the outside, which is what I call climate crisis, our own shadow coming back upon us.
And here we are where all of our addictions, or a lot of them, are being denied just by the circumstance. We're in lockdown, the stores are closed, you can't go out and do your shopping habit or your socializing habit. And it seems like, I've had a lot of friends mention this too, seems like everybody's in a pressure cooker, and people that were normally, pretty even-tempered are kind of going off the hees. So how much of that addiction and being denied those particular addictions is pushing us into irrational behavior?
Golda, I have never thought of that. I love that you just said that. It's like an epiphany for me. That I've looked at a lot of these dynamics, but I've never looked at the addiction dynamic and how we've been prevented from being able to pursue a lot of our addictions. And yeah, so if addiction is a coping mechanism, right, to defend against what hurts or what's difficult, then yeah, like if you can't be the addict and you can't pursue these things, then your your material is going to come to the surface pretty quickly. And you see that in people that try to stop smoking or stop trying to drink alcohol or stop eating emotionally. So yeah, so great point.
Yeah,
Hat
and
tip.
I think it plays a huge role in pushing us deeper into denial. So at that point, aren't we given a choice to either do that inner depth work or destabilize?
Right, Quilda. And what comes up for me is that, well, what happens when we lose that layer of buffering with our addiction, right? It's like our material comes up, and what do? The anger comes up for me, right? There's been so much anger, so much lashing out. I think it's so easy to be to be angry. And right, and beneath anger is often the grief and the pain. And so I don't think collectively we've gotten to a lot of that pain. A lot of the people that I deal with and my friends have felt it, and we share about that in support groups, etc. But I think that so much of the anger and reactivity, kind of amalgamates with the fear and creates this just chaos and panic.
Chaos. Well, it's time for another break. We'll discuss more about this on the other side. Jack and I will be back shortly to continue our discussion, so don't you go away. This is Mission Evolution on the X Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net. Welcome back. This is Mission Evolution, bringing together gifted people of service to the world. I love to hear from our audience. Your input is very important to me. To suggest a topic or a guest that you think would be of interest, email us at info@missionevolution.org. This hour, we're sharing thoughts with Jack Adam Weber. His website, jackadamweber.com. Jack, let's change gears a little bit because you engage in holistic medicine. Would you please tell our listeners what that is?
Well, I sort of did that at the beginning, didn't I?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring it back because I'd kind of like to look at it in the how we can apply holistic medicine to the shadow work that we're looking at doing now, what we've been talking about.
Okay. So holistic medicine or Chinese medicine, which is what I practice primarily. I think there are two ways that it can help that come up. One is using the metaphors of the medicine, which I described earlier in our show here, and the other is just through self-care, like acupuncture, Tuina massage, dietary therapeutics, herbal medicine, meditation, connection with nature. These things are the the pillars of Chinese medicine, and these all help us sort of process things on a mind body level. And then the metaphors of Chinese medicine, which we spoke about, being in tune with the seasons helps us connect with the natural world in a in a really nuanced, beautiful way that also teaches us lessons about how to conduct ourselves. And we talked about that through life, death, and rebirth.
It seems to me that the earth is such a rich, the natural world is such a rich source of balance because it's constantly moving and constantly remaining in balance in its own way.
Right.
How can we possibly, I mean, we say, well, we're imbalanced, and that imbalance is now showing out up in our outer world, by the abuse that we've done to each other and the planet. But we can't come from a balanced place if our bodies are imbalanced. Is that how this is going to help?
Is that how what?
Is that how holistic medicine and Chinese medicine can help? Is all these different aspects bringing your body back into a balance so you can express through the body in a balanced way?
Yes, I think that's one aspect of it. So I think that's the easiest way, perhaps, that's the physiological way. And the other way that I've described for most of the show is the psychological, emotional, spiritual way, which is going through the death and rebirth process of grief work. So yes, so these are the different levels on which we can use holistic medicine to address our whole being, ourselves, and our relationship with the world, right? So in an eco-psychological sense, and yin yang as light and dark, right? That represents conscious and unconscious. And then the five elements, which are the further breakdown of yin and yang, which is following the seasons, which goes from light to dark, right? Winter is the nadir of darkness, and summer is the apex of light, which is yang. And so, there's no time here, obviously, to get into details about this, but those models are beautiful, rich wisdom models for how to live in balance inwardly and outwardly.
All traditions have some form of ceremony or practice that helps their people, historically, align with light and dark, align with the seasons, align with the earth and her cycles. And now we've kind of deteriorated those into, instead of the winter solstice, it's Christmas and all the marketing. But originally those things were designed to help us stay attuned. Do we have enough of those left, and can we re-engage? Do you have any place that you recommend people find that?
I think rituals are really important, and celebrating the solstices, sort of instead of, or at least more than, that the frivolousness of Christmas is important. So I'd say definitely, being mindful of the equinoxes and the solstices and having ceremony around that, and celebrating the sort of more pagan sort of, natural rhythms of the earth will bring us back to the earth instead of to the, capitalistic consumerist models that we've sort of, distorted the holidays into. So I think coming back to a nature-based reverence of the world and the rituals and the ceremonies and the natural cycles that go along with that. And those are all mirrored in Chinese medicine, yin yang and the five elements I just mentioned. So I think that's very important.
You mentioned pagan, and pagan has a bad name, a bad rap. It's like
Mm-hmm.
some people, they hear pagan, they think, oh no, it's anti-Christ, it's anti-Christian.
Yeah.
But Jesus practiced all of this 40
Yeah.
days and 40 nights in the wilderness. I mean, he spoke of all of this. It's not a dark art so much as
Uh,
coming back in balance with the natural world. Is that
right.
what you mean by pagan?
Yeah, that's the sense I meant in it. I didn't mean it in some like, weird occultish kind of thing or anything pejorative. I just meant it in the sense that I would mention Taoism, right? Taoism itself, from which Chinese medicine sprung, is simply a way of living in harmony with the natural world. And so that's what I meant.
Beautiful. So, what are the physiological impact of denial? Because we talked about how damaging denial can be from a Chinese medical perspective. What starts to happen physiologically?
I love your questions, Gwilda. I just have to say this, that these are some of the most challenging questions I've ever been asked in an interview, and I had no idea any of these were coming, right? So you didn't brief me on any of this, so I'm just answering from from the innards here. So denial, right, is a repression, and so whether we're repressing grief or repressing anger, repressing fear, those cause what's called in Chinese medicine stagnation, right? And so a lot of people know that this kind of new age expression of go with the flow, right? Well, that kind of derives from uh, uh, a cornerstone of Chinese medicine, which is that the qi, or body's energy, always needs to be flowing, right? And where stagnation occurs, disease happens. So emotional repression is just as significant, if not more significant, than like physical repression, whether we're eating a horrible diet or we're not moving. So if you sit on your couch day in and day out and don't get out and exercise, you're going to develop stagnation. But stagnation also happens mentally, and it happens emotionally. So being able to move through these things helps prevent denial, and denial creates this kind of stagnation. So the answer is that there are lots of ways that we can move the stagnation of denial. That's physiological, that's cognitive, mental, and also emotional.
Denial can actually cause kind of a psychosis, doesn't it? I mean, it's like you're not in the present moment.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, that gets into some nitty gritty about, how we're defining psychosis and stuff. But
Right.
it certainly can lead to disillusionment and delusion about what's real and what's not real. Yes,
Yeah, the delusional part, I think, is we're seeing a lot of that. And now,
yes.
how does the physiological impact of denial compare to the impact caused by fear and anxiety? Again, from a Chinese perspective.
Well, I think that they're different dynamics, right? So denial. So let's just kind of narrow that a little bit, just for the sake of discussion here, so that if we look at denial of fear and anxiety, versus just experiencing fear and anxiety, then that sort of that paints the picture. So, if we're denying our fear, I think we're just causing that kind of repression and that bottled up fear, which often, in my experience and observation, shows up, manifests as anger and rage when we deny that fear, right? Because that fear is the fight or flight response. So if we suppress the fight or flight response, whoa, that's like, that's the energy of saving oneself and protecting oneself. So if we deny that, that's what rage often looks like. So I think if we're experiencing our fear and experiencing our anxiety and working with those with emotional intelligence, and I go into that very deeply in the book. I can't go into it here because there's not time. But when we work with these emotions, right, we're not denying them, nor are we merely displacing them onto the world. And so that's the sweet spot that we want. We want the integration where we welcome and experience the emotion, but also curb it and work with it as necessary.
I love that. I love that word displace, because there we have projection. And I don't know about you, but it seems to me like there's a whole bunch of projection going on that is putting the angst we feel inside and casting it out around us, and then having this feedback loop with ourselves, with our own projections. And how do we recognize when we're doing that, and how do we stop it?
Oh God, that's a good question. That's the hurt people hurt others dynamic. And another one of my mentors, psychotherapist, Jungian psychotherapist Dave Rico, I like how he breaks down projection and displacement. He says that these are my own words, that we project our issues and our stories and our dynamics onto others and onto the world, but we displace our emotion, right? So I found it very helpful to mine that difference. So, okay, now that I said that, I forgot your question. Please remind me of it.
That's okay. I was asking how we can recognize when we are projecting rather than processing.
Okay, I think that goes back to self-knowledge, know thyself, like you said, so that having experience of working within oneself, knowing what our issues are, knowing if we have fear of abandonment, knowing if we have fear of engulfment. Those are just two relationship dynamics that are quite prominent, and just noticing what our issues are. And also there's in the book I discuss emotional shadow work. So all of us, I think, are have an easier time with certain emotions and a more difficult time with other emotions. So if, for example, it's very uncomfortable for you or me to feel fear, well, then that's an area that we can watch, so that if fear comes our way or if anger comes our way, a little light goes in our head, which is the self-awareness. Okay, I have issues with anger. I have issues with fear. And then we're already in a field of sort of being more of the observer of what we're doing, or at least coming back and observing ourselves and revisiting, a dynamic that we had, whether it's, in a personal relationship or, at work or whatever. So it comes back to this know thyself, and know thyself enough to be able to pause and to notice what our issues are, and then to mitigate and work with them, and not merely project and displace them.
So by knowing ourselves, recognizing these are our issues, owning them, that keeps us in the driver's seat rather than giving away our power.
It's a good way to summarize it.
Okay. We're just about out of time. What is your vision?
Job here.
What is your vision for the future?
Boy. A great question to ask when we're out of time, Gwilda. I would have to say I put that vision into the book. I think it's the summary of all that we've described here. I think we have to create new outer systems, right? I mean, there's been elitists and families and the corporate elite that we know that are out there that have been kind of running the show, and the fossil fuel companies.
I'm afraid I did cut you too short on this one. So I, in closing, will tell people where they can get your book to find out the answer to that. But unfortunately, we are out of time, Jack. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Gwilda. Talk to you soon.
Our guest this hour has been licensed Chinese medicine clinician Jack Adam Weber. Jack is the author of Climate Cure, Heal Yourself to Heal the Planet. His website, jackadamweber.com. Remember, our entire information-packed past episode collection is available for listener download free of charge. Visit our archives at www.missionevolution.org for our ever-growing selection of guests and topics. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka on the X Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net. Join us next time as the mission continues, bringing information, resources, and support to our evolving world.